All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most famous and now infamous experiments in the history of psychology. It's a story about fooling an entire profession, and it changed everything, just maybe not in the way you think. So, picture this. It's 1973. A Stanford psychologist named David Rosenhan comes along and asks a really explosive question. A question that was about to shake the very foundations of psychiatry. Okay, so Rosenhan's study, it was called On Being Sane in Insane Places. It landed like an absolute bombshell. This was right at the height of the anti-psychiatry movement. When people were seriously asking, is mental illness even a real thing? Or is it just a label we stick on people who don't quite fit in? And his main target? Well, it was the diagnostic Bible of the time, the DSM-2. The problem was it was seen as just wildly subjective. I mean, think about it. You could walk into one hospital with a set of symptoms and get one diagnosis, and then go to another hospital in a different state and get a completely different one. It was a mess. And that's the system he was determined to expose.
So, what was the plan? How was he going to test this? Well, his idea was both super simple and incredibly audacious. He wondered, could a group of perfectly sane, normal people get themselves committed to a psychiatric hospital? And here's the real kicker. Once they were in, could they prove they were sane and get themselves out?
So here's how the experiment was designed, and it was pretty clever. He got a group of 8 totally sane volunteers. We're talking psychologists, a painter, a housewife, a real mix of people. They'd show up at 12 different psych hospitals. Their instructions were to tell just one lie, that they were hearing voices saying these 3 specific words: thud, hollow, and empty. That's it. Everything else, their life story, their relationships, was supposed to be completely true. And then, the moment they got admitted, they were told to stop faking anything and just act totally normal. The big question was, would anyone even notice? And the result? It was stunning. An immediate, catastrophic failure of the system. Every single one of the 8 pseudo-patients was admitted. Just think about that. A single, pretty vague symptom was all it took for these doctors to completely dismiss a lifetime of sanity. But this is where it gets really fascinating. Once they were inside, their perfectly normal behaviors were seen through this new lens of illness. For example, when they took notes for the experiment, the staff wrote it down in their charts as engages in writing behavior, as if it were a symptom. Pacing the hallways out of sheer boredom? Nope, that was interpreted as anxiety. Waiting for lunch? That was called oral acquisitive behavior. It's like the label of insane colored everything they did. And get this, their hospital stays lasted anywhere from a week to almost 2 months. And in all that time, not a single doctor, not one nurse, or any staff member figured out they were fakes. But you know who did suspect something was up? The actual patients. Yeah, a bunch of them came up to the pseudo-patients and were like, "You're not crazy. You're a journalist, right? Or a professor?" So for Rosenhan, this was the smoking gun. It proved what he called the stickiness of labels. Once you're slapped with a label like schizophrenic, it's like you can't shake it. Every single thing you do from that point on is just seen as more proof of your diagnosis. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, but the story gets even crazier. After the results were published, one hospital was absolutely furious. They were convinced their staff was better than that, so they basically threw down a challenge to Rosenhan. They said, "Send your fake patients to us. We guarantee you, we will spot them." And Rosenhan was like, game on. So for the next 3 months, this hospital was on high alert. You can just imagine the staff, right? Scrutinizing every single new patient who walks through the door, trying to figure out who was the imposter Rosenhan sent. And you know what? They were pretty proud of themselves. They were confident they found them. Over that period, the staff flagged 41 different patients that they identified with high confidence as being one of Rosenhan's fakes. And now, for the incredible, devastating punchline, how many fake patients had Rosenhan actually sent to that hospital? 0. Absolutely none. Not a single one. All those people they flagged as imposters, they were real patients who genuinely needed help. The experiment proved the system was totally unreliable. It couldn't tell the sane from the insane, and it couldn't tell the insane from the sane. It was broken in both directions. So for almost half a century, that was the story. It became a legend. It was taught in every single intro to psychology textbook as this classic, perfect experiment, a powerful lesson about the dangers of psychiatric labels. And then, the whole thing started to unravel.
Fast forward to 2019. An investigative journalist named Susanna Kawalin publishes this bombshell of a book. She spent years digging into Rosenhan's work, and what she found didn't just raise a few questions. It suggested that this legendary study might have been a complete and total fraud.
See, Kahalan managed to get her hands on something no one had ever seen before. Rosenhan's private notes, his personal files, and the hospital records he desperately tried to keep hidden. And what she found told a much, much darker story than the one he'd been telling everyone for decades. Okay, this slide right here gets to the heart of the deception. On the left, you have this simple, clean story Rosenhan published. I just said I heard thud, hollow, and empty. But on the right, that's what his actual hospital records showed. And it's a completely different picture. He didn't just mention 3 words. He described having suicidal thoughts. He talked about putting copper pots on his ears and sensitivity to radio waves. The thing is, the doctors didn't misdiagnose a sane man. They accurately diagnosed a man who presented a textbook case of severe psychosis. He didn't just tell one lie, he told a whole lot of them. And it gets worse. Remember those 8 pseudo-patients? The painter, the housewife, the psychiatrist? Well, Callahan went looking for them. She spent years trying to track them down. And guess what? After all that digging, she could only find and confirm 2 of them. What about the other 5? It's looking more and more likely that Rosenhan just made them up. But maybe the most damning piece of evidence is what Rosenhan chose to leave out. Kalin's investigation uncovered a 9th pseudo-patient, a guy named Harry Lando. His experience was completely erased from the final paper, and a handwritten note from Rosenhan on Lando's file pretty much explains why. Yeah, so it turns out Harry Lando actually had a good experience. He said the staff was caring, that he found the other patients interesting, and that the whole thing was actually kind of therapeutic. Well, that didn't exactly fit the story Rosenhan wanted to tell, did it? This data completely contradicted his narrative of terrible, dehumanizing hospitals. So what do you do with data that doesn't fit your story? If you're David Rosenhan, you just pretend it doesn't exist. You bury it. And that, right there, is a profound breach of scientific ethics. So, wow, the whole thing was basically a fraud. What do we do with that? What does it mean for the enormous impact the study had on the world? It really makes you wonder, right? If you tell a lie, but it leads to a good outcome, is it still a lie? Because let's be clear, the influence of this fraudulent study was absolutely massive. It fueled the movement to shut down the old, massive asylums. It directly led to a complete overhaul of the diagnostic manual, forcing the creation of the much more rigorous DSM-3. I mean, it fundamentally changed the entire field of psychiatry. So we're left with this really uncomfortable, complicated legacy. On one hand, the experiment was a scientific lie. It was built on fabricated data, cherry-picked results, and outright deception. But, on the other hand, it exposed a very real truth. The psychiatric hospitals back in the 70s often were terrible places. The way people were diagnosed was a mess. So Rosenhan basically used a lie to shine a light on a much bigger truth. And that's really the question the Rosenhan experiment leaves us wrestling with, even today. It forces us to ask ourselves a tough question. What do we value more? A really compelling story that gets people's attention and creates real change? Or the complicated, inconvenient, messy facts that make up the truth?